The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically sensitive locations on Earth. Roughly 20% of global oil supply passes through it. Any serious military planning involving Iran would inevitably include scenarios like mining or threatening the strait, harassing oil tankers, using fast boats, drones, or anti-ship missiles. These are not surprises. They're baseline assumptions in wargaming. The former CIA director, this question, with any calculation about attacking Iran in a way that the United States and Israel ended up doing, and I would have thought it would be reasonably obvious that they may also attack some of their Gulf state neighbors in the way that they have done, oil refineries and so on, if their own refineries came under attack. None of this seems to me to be exactly rocket science, and yet the administrations of both countries appear to have been taken a bit by surprise.
The president wanted to declare victory and bring the war to an end. We certainly have achieved a lot of our military objectives there, but the problem was that with the Straits of Hormuz closed, frankly, Iran had a great deal of leverage, and there wasn't much chance of getting a ceasefire without the straits being open. So the president faced a choice. Do you open the Straits of Hormuz militarily? Do you try to negotiate? Do you try to get our allies to be able to open it? He was struggling to try to find an answer. And evidently, there began to be some negotiations here. And now he's held up on strikes. And the hope is that they can find a way to open up the Straits of Hormuz. The Iranians are probably the best people that could do that because they know where the mines are and they know how to clear the straits in a much more rapid way than anybody else.
Recent reporting says the Trump administration is explicitly demanding that Iran give up its enriched uranium and is even weighing an operation to seize it, precisely because bombing alone does not solve the stockpile of the uranium. Iran still possesses the same enriched uranium it had before this war started. Netanyahu has said so publicly that air power alone cannot win this war in the way that they originally intended, which would include getting their hands on the enriched uranium. Is there any other way to get that enriched uranium? Assuming the Iranians don't just hand it over as part of a deal, which I think is extremely unlikely. Is there any way to get it other than to use ground troops? And how big a risk would that be for Donald Trump to commit US ground forces?
No, I think one of the concerns is that there wasn't a lot of time kind of considering the consequences of what could happen when you attack Iran. I mean, we had looked at the potential of some kind of conflict with Iran, and it was very clear to all of us that one of the first things that Iran would do is close the Straits of Hormuz. It's an obvious result. It's easy to close, and it can impact on oil prices and creates a tremendous amount of pressure on whoever's attacking Iran. So what concerns me is I think they really didn't focus on that as a very real consequence. They seemed ill prepared to deal with it rather than having a plan of how you would maintain the straits to be open. And as a result of that, I think Iran developed even more leverage in terms of trying to make the United States understand that the regime was very much in charge of the Straits of Hormuz, and that as long as that was happening, prices of oil would increase dramatically. It would impact on prices not only here in this country, but throughout the world, and that at some point it could have a major impact on the economies of the world. And I think the president understood ultimately that the only alternative he had was to find a way to get the straits open. Now they're hopefully in discussions, and if they can open the straits, I think there is a chance that perhaps this war could be brought to an end.
So to core question, is there any way to get the uranium other than ground troops? In practical terms, not really, unless Iran hands it over or an outside mechanism is negotiated. If the goal is to physically possess the material rather than merely damage the program, some form of ground access is the obvious requirement. That does not necessarily mean a massive Iraq-style invasion, but it does mean troops on Iranian territory.
Well, there's no question that that would be a very tough military operation. This stuff is buried deep in the ground. Nobody has any easy access to it. They would have to be able to rappel down and probably face a tremendous amount of opposition there, since it's such a clear objective for the United States. So, in the end, the best way to deal with that issue is to get energy authorities to again go back into Iran, to be able to inspect and be able to make sure that that enriched fuel does not wind up in a nuclear weapon. That's probably the best way to ultimately deal with the nuclear threat.
That is also consistent with recent US reporting about considering an extraction mission rather than relying on bombing alone. As for the risk to Donald Trump of committing US ground forces, it looks very high on 3 levels. Iran has already shown it can retaliate across the region, and analysts cited by Reuters warn that ground operations would expose US troops to drones, missiles, mines, and wider escalation. Even limited objectives such as seizing Kharg Island are described as highly dangerous because forces would be exposed and difficult to protect.
Then there's the whole question of ground forces. We should talk more about this. We don't have any serious ground forces option. This is a joke, right? There's just no ground forces option there. And in fact, if we go down that road, we're just going to make a bad situation even worse. He can't find the exit ramp now. And if he thinks about going up the escalation ladder, he gets stymied on every rung. Now, why do I say that? First of all, Iran can wreck the international economy. It can wreck the international economy. And one could argue that we're sort of heading in that direction. I like to say there's an iceberg out there in the water, and we're heading towards that iceberg. We are the Titanic. And I think President Trump basically understands that. And I think his advisors understand that. And they're trying to turn the ship so that we don't hit the iceberg.
Once US troops are on Iranian soil, the mission can expand. A raid can become a rescue can become reinforcement, and reinforcement can become an open-ended war. Current debate in Washington reflects exactly that fear. Lawmakers from both parties have voiced concern about entering a conflict without a clear end state, political risk. For Trump specifically, a ground war would collide with his long-standing political image as someone who criticizes endless wars. Reports note that he has been trying to avoid a prolonged conflict, even while keeping military options open, and Congress is already showing skepticism about escalation. If American casualties mounted without a clear success, the domestic political cost could be severe. Bottom line is, if the objective is to physically remove Iran's enriched uranium, air power alone is probably insufficient. The realistic alternatives are either a negotiated handover or some kind of ground seizure mission, and the closer that mission gets to real Iranian territory, defended sites, and sustained presence, the closer it gets to exactly the kind of war that would carry enormous military, economic, and political risk for Trump.
And one could argue that we're sort of heading in that direction. I like to say there's an iceberg out there in the water, and we're heading towards that iceberg. We are the Titanic. And I think President Trump basically understands that. And I think his advisors understand that. And they're trying to turn the ship so that we don't hit the iceberg. But anyway, my first point is that Iran can wreck the international economy. Furthermore, it can literally destroy most of the Gulf states, because those states depend on desalination plants, and they depend on oil infrastructure. And those targets are easy for the Iranians to hit. And if the Iranians decided that they were going to go after a country like Saudi Arabia and take out all their desalination plants and take out their oil or energy infrastructure, they basically wreck Saudi Arabia.